Shane from Kolkata. Welcome to Science Prodigy. Today we will be starting the first chapter of class 8, which is structure of atom. But before that, I would like to tell you that I will be completing all the chapters of classes 8 and 9 from physics, chemistry and mathematics, and I will ensure that they are completed before your final exams. So please do subscribe my channel if you have not subscribed it till now, because you will be extremely benefited, because I will try to cover everything in detail, including question answers, important questions and every important core insights that are present in each and every chapter. I'll try to deal with physics, chemistry and mathematics. You can go and see the channel that previously also videos have been uploaded and a few chapters have also been completed in great details. So without any more delay, let's begin. So first of all, the most important thing is, when we begin with the structure of atom, initially it started with Dalton's atomic theory. So now Dalton's atomic theory basically consisted of a few postulates, that is, certain things which he thought were essentially true, but later on they failed and they were also proved wrong. But the most important significant part is, we are studying Dalton's law, Dalton's theory, because we can understand that it has got some significance in the later on discoveries of electron, proton and neutron. So although it was a failure, it is important in understanding how it served as a precursor to what was coming up next in the few hundred years. So to begin with the ancient or the much old Dalton's atomic theory, the first postulate was that atoms are indivisible. That is, any matter is constituted of very tiny, very microscopic, indivisible particles. Indivisible means it cannot be divided into further parts. That means atom is the last part. It cannot be divided into any more parts. So this was later on proved wrong as well. But Dalton said that atoms are the indivisible particles of matter. So this was the first postulate of Dalton's theory, that atoms are the indivisible particles. Atoms cannot be divided further. Then comes the fact that atoms are neither created nor destroyed during a chemical reaction. We know this very much from the last classes also, from the previous classes also, that atoms can never be destroyed nor be created during a chemical reaction, because if that would have happened, it would have caused a violation of the law of conservation of mass. Okay, so now moving on to the third postulate, that atoms of a particular element are all identical. That means if I say the atom of sulfur, for example, they are all identical, but it is different from the atoms of the element magnesium. So atoms of a particular element are identical, but different from the atoms of some other element. That is, atoms of sulfur, all the atoms of sulfur are the same, are identical, but they are different from the atoms of magnesium. Fourth postulate was, atoms always combine in fixed whole number integral ratios with some other atoms of the same or of different elements to form a compound. That means atoms always have a fixed ratio. So if I am forming NaCl, NaCl has the fixed ratio where Na and Cl are in the ratio 1:1. So that is a very fixed ratio that will never vary. Then comes the rearrangement in the chemical reactions. As I said, atoms are neither created nor destroyed during a chemical reaction, because if that would have happened, it would violate the law of conservation of mass, because mass can never be destroyed nor created. So as a result of that, during a chemical reaction, the atoms are just rearranged. The atoms in the reactant side are just rearranged to give the atoms on the product side. There is no creation, no destruction, just a rearrangement of the atoms during a chemical reaction. So with this, we sum up the basic and the most important postulates of Dalton's atomic theory. But then we come to know, after a few years, it was known that Dalton's atomic theory was not right, because William Crookes had performed an experiment in a glass tube. The glass tube was actually filled with vacuum. Filled with vacuum means it was just evacuated. There was no air inside it. And inside the glass tube, there were two electrodes placed. One electrode was connected to the negative terminal of a battery. The electrode connected to the negative terminal of the battery is the cathode. And the electrode connected to the positive terminal, that is the positively charged electrode, is known as the anode. So the positively charged electrode is the anode and the negatively charged electrode is the cathode. So now William Crookes performed the experiment and he found that certain rays were traveling from the cathode. So he was actually observing through a magnet that these rays, these cathode rays, were actually getting deflected in a magnetic field. So that was only his observation, that there were certain rays emerging out from the cathode and these rays were actually getting deflected towards the magnet. So they were actually having a deflection during the influence of a magnetic field. But then came J.J. Thomson. J.J. Thomson applied electric field. He used the same setup, everything same, but the only thing is J.J. Thomson used the application of an electric field. The moment he applied an electric field, J.J. Thomson found that these cathode rays were actually deviating towards the positive plate. So now, because the cathode rays were deviating towards the positive rays, that means they were negatively charged. Because they were moving towards the positive plate, that means they must be oppositely charged. So they were negatively charged. So he concluded that these cathode rays are negatively charged, and J.J. Thomson was the first to name them electrons. So the naming part of the cathode rays was done by J.J. Thomson, who named the cathode rays which constituted of negatively charged particles as electrons. He even concluded that electrons are present in every matter. Why? Because when he used different metal electrodes, that is when he was actually replacing the cathode with some cathode of a different metal, the same observation came up. The cathode of one metal, cathode of some second metal, cathode of some third metal, for every particular cathode, the same observation was followed. That means in every metal, in every matter, the same electrons are present. So electrons are the constituting particles of matter. So to sum up, I just recap from the first part, that is from William Crookes' part. William Crookes was only able to create this particular glass tube. He was actually carrying out the observation with the help of a magnetic field. So Crookes' tube was actually under the application of a magnetic field, that yes, they were getting deflected by a magnetic field. But then came J.J. Thomson, who used electric field. The moment J.J. Thomson used electric field, he saw that these rays were deflecting towards the positively charged plate. That means these negatively charged plates, these negatively charged rays should be named as electrons. And that's how it started. And he took up certain important conclusions as well. The important conclusions being, the first most important conclusion was, he could not determine either the mass nor the charge, but he could determine the charge to the mass ratio. That is, J.J. Thomson could actually determine the E by M value of electron. He could not find the charge, neither the mass, but the E by M ratio found by J.J. Thomson was 1.78 into 10 to the power 8 coulomb per gram. So this was the first observation. Then cathode rays are constituted of electrons. Electrons are nothing but negatively charged particles. Now continuing with the most important properties of electrons that were found later on, the most important property was the electrons were actually thought to carry a -1 charge, that is the negative charge of -1 unit, which was the basic unit for electric charge. Then the mass of an electron was found to be 9.11 into 10 to the power -31 kg. So these were certain basic observations when it came to electrons, and this was such a small mass that is we can also consider the mass of an electron as negligible, because this value is actually 1 by 1840 times the mass of hydrogen. So you can understand that the mass of an electron is nearly negligible, nearly zero. So now moving forward to the discovery of protons. Now, another property of cathode rays is luminescence. That is, they actually illuminate the part of the glass slab which they strike. That means if I consider just a rough diagram, it's very rough. That means if I consider there was a cathode and the light rays was falling through, in this location there will be a luminescence observed. That means it will be lighting up the region, which is a property of the cathode rays. Now moving forward to the discovery of proton, because atoms are electrically neutral and we have already found that electrons are negatively charged, that means there should be a positively charged particle which should actually cancel each other such that the atom stays electrically neutral. And due to that, with the search of these positively charged particles, Eugene Goldstein performed an experiment with perforated cathode. Now in this experiment, the cathode was actually made to have very small holes. That is, it was perforated with very small holes. This was the basic, and the entire setup remains the same. Now the most important part for the discovery of proton was the observation. The observation made by Eugene Goldstein was that not just the cathode rays were moving from the cathode towards the anode, but there was also an observation of certain rays which were actually starting from the anode, passing through the perforations of the cathode and causing an illumination on the back side of the anode. Now the moment these rays were passing from the anode through the perforated parts and causing a luminescence, he could conclude that these rays were moving from the anode, and he named them, and they were obviously, because it was moving from the anode, so they must be positively charged, and he named them the positive rays or the canal rays. He also carried out the experiment in the same situation just like J.J. Thomson. That is, the experiment was carried out in the presence of an electric field only. The only thing is the illuminescence behind actually proved that there are positively charged rays moving as well. So now if I take certain basic properties of a proton, the most important property is that proton is actually thought to carry a +1 basic unit charge, which is the basic charge, which is the basic unit of electric charge. This So proton is actually the same that of an hydrogen, which is 1.672 into 10 to the power minus 27 kg. Now we will be beginning with the Thomson's plum pudding model. Why was the Thomson's plum pudding model given up by Thomson? Because we can see that Dalton's theory has failed. Dalton said that there is nothing more after atoms. But the moment J.J. Thomson, Goldstein already proved that atoms are divisible into protons and electrons. So keeping in mind the electrical neutrality of an atom, Thomson provided his basis of the inner structure of the atom, which is often known as Thomson's plum pudding model. Now the basic constituent of the Thomson's plum pudding model is like this particular sphere is a sphere of positive charge. We can see that this sphere is nothing but a sphere of positive charge which is having, it is a sea of positive charge, and this sphere can be actually assumed to be a pudding. So it is like a pudding where these negatively charged electrons are present. So in this particular sphere of positive charge, the negatively charged electrons are present. So these electrons are just like the plum in a pudding. But later on, this was just the basis of understanding that maybe this is how an atom looks like. But then came Rutherford's alpha scattering experiment. And with that due course, J.J. Thomson's plum pudding model was understood to be wrong. So it is a process of learning. That is, people are trying to learn how an atom can look like. Is the atom looking like this? Is it looking like this? And certain basic observations were done so that we can understand what is the structure. And with all these failures, today we have landed up in a very appropriate, or to some extent we may know that there can be future changes as well, but we have come to a conclusion. So this is how you learn from your failures, and that's what happened. Rutherford's alpha scattering experiment happened just after Thomson's plum pudding model. And then Rutherford said that no, this cannot be so, because Rutherford's alpha scattering experiment has actually changed the due course of things. What happened in the experiment was very simple. It was actually that Rutherford took a very thin gold foil, and with the help of this gold foil, he actually ensured that certain rays, that is certain alpha rays, alpha means it is nothing but it is a doubly charged helium nuclei. Doubly charged helium nuclei is the alpha rays, and these alpha rays were made to strike the gold foil. Now when it comes to Rutherford's alpha scattering experiment, as I said, what is alpha particle? Alpha particle is the doubly charged helium nuclei. So this is nothing but an alpha particle. So now very fast moving alpha particles were made to strike the extremely thin gold foil. So the most important thing of this experiment is the kind of observations. The observations were somewhat like, the first observation was most of the alpha particles passed straight through the foil without any kind of deflection. That means this was the foil, the alpha particles passed straight through the foil. That is 90%, approximately 90% of them passed straight through the foil without any kind of deflection. So there was no deflection for majority of them. Now the next observation was a few alpha particles had deflected. So majority of them were passing straight without any deflection or without any deviation, but a few, very few alpha particles were deflecting, and they were deflecting at different angles. Some were striking the nucleus, maybe they were deflecting at this sort of an angle or more angles. Some had even retraced their path. Retraceability was for very few cases. That means it's striking the nucleus and just retracing its path. That was very rare, but basically for a very few, the diffraction and deflection at different angles were observed. So from this, Rutherford came to a conclusion. The first conclusion was, because the alpha particles were passing straight without any kind of deflection, that means it is having, the atoms are having enough free space, enough empty space. And due to enough empty space present inside an atom, they can pass through straight without any kind of deflection because of the enough empty space present in an atom. But because, now the next conclusion was, we went through the observation, some deflected at a few angles, some were not deflected, some retraced. Now the first conclusion from the observation, what conclusion we draw? That there is enough empty space. Why? Because they are passing undeflected. Because they are passing undeflected. The next conclusion was, there is a very tiny, extremely heavy, positively charged core may be at the center. And this positively charged core, because it was positively charged and the alpha ray is also positively charged, that means because it was striking positive charge, repulsive forces will act. And as a result of that, because of the tiny and the heavy and the positively charged nucleus at the center, we came to the conclusion that because of this, the alpha particles were deflecting, and the ones which actually struck the alpha particles straight through, they were able to retrace their path as well because of the repulsive forces operating between the alpha particles and the nucleus. So because of the tiny, heavy, positively charged nucleus, it should be positively charged, or else alpha particles cannot show deflection, but they are very tiny. Why tiny? Because not every alpha particle is going through deflection. A few are going through, that means it occupies very less space. So, with this conclusion, Rutherford proposed his Rutherford's planetary model of the atom. What is Rutherford's planetary model? As per the conclusion, the nucleus is occupying is a positively charged, dense, having high mass and a tiny centrally located part of the atom. So, this is how the nucleus was constituted, and in the rest of this free space was actually occupied by the electrons which were moving about in circular orbits. These are the circular orbits, and the electrons were assumed to move around in the circular orbits just like the planets. All the other planets move around the sun. So it was also kept in mind that the positive charge of the nucleus equals the negative charge of the total number of electrons, because at the end of the day the atoms must be electrically neutral. So keeping in mind the electrical neutrality of an atom, the positive charge of the nucleus should also be equal to the negative charge of the nucleus. And as because the electrons were moving about in circular orbits, just like any planet moves around the sun centrally located, so it is just like the planetary motion. So that is why it was termed as Rutherford's planetary model of atom. This was actually very much as per his observations. That is, it was complying with whatever observations he came up with. So this served to be a right conclusion and a right picture of the inner structure of an atom. So we end this with Rutherford's planetary model, and I would say that in the next video we will be completing all the remaining parts. We will be trying to cover the next parts in few 2-3 videos. I'll be discussing important questions and doing this chapter in details. Till then, if you have not subscribed, subscribe the channel and stay tuned, keep watching, keep studying. Thank you.